Bastogne, Belgium, December 1944. The cold is doing things bullets do not have to do. It is freezing blood in medical tubes. It is locking tank tracks to the road. It is turning every breath from the 101st Airborne into white smoke that disappears above foxholes cut into frozen ground. And the Germans are closing the ring. 5 divisions are tightening around the town. The roads in are cut. The skies are sealed by weather. The wounded are lying in stone buildings with no heat, and every hour the perimeter gets smaller. Then, south of Bastogne, a different sound begins. Sherman engines, hard starting, coughing, catching. The men climbing into those tanks have spent 2 years being told the same thing in different uniforms. They were told they were not smart enough for armored warfare. They were told they did not have the initiative for command. They were told that a Black Tank Battalion was an experiment the Army could postpone, inspect, delay, and doubt. Their battalion was the 761st, the Black Panthers, and before the winter was over, German officers would describe the American armor that broke their positions with 2 words. Not race, not color, not politics, speed, and refusal. Refusal to stop. To understand why that mattered, you have to go back 2 months before Bastogne, to a muddy road near Nancy, France, where one white lieutenant made the mistake of believing the old army still applied. A black officer passed him on the road. The white lieutenant did not salute. In the United States Army, a salute is not politeness. It is not personal approval. It is the visible language of rank. A salute says, "I recognize the authority on your collar." And in the segregated army of 1944, that recognition was often treated as optional when the officer wearing the rank was black. Black officers knew the routine. Some white enlisted men ignored them. Some white officers looked through them. Some violations were reported. Most were swallowed. Because the message was never accidental. Your commission exists on paper. Your authority exists only when we choose to see it. But George Patton saw this one. His vehicle stopped. He stepped out into the mud. He ordered the white lieutenant to salute, right there, in front of everyone. Then Patton returned the salute to the black officer himself. No committee, no memorandum, no investigation that would vanish into channels. Just one public enforcement of a rule that should never have needed courage to enforce. The story moved through the Third Army faster than a dispatch. Because for the men of the 761st, it did not mean the army had suddenly become just. It meant something narrower. On Patton's road, rank was rank. And if rank could be enforced in public, maybe performance could be measured in public too. The 761st had been waiting for that chance for 2 years. They had trained at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, while white armored units shipped out to North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and France. They trained under a shadow cast by an old War College report that had argued black soldiers lacked the qualities needed for armored combat. The men knew what was written about them, so they made themselves impossible to dismiss in training. They drilled until the crews moved around their Shermans by touch. They learned engines, guns, tracks, radios, and recovery procedures in heat, mud, and rain. They trained knowing inspectors were not looking for proof of readiness. They were looking for an excuse. The excuses kept coming. A review board questioned their discipline. Another questioned their readiness. Minor infractions became major doubts. Delay became policy without anyone having to call it that. Then in October 1944, Patton's Third Army needed armor, not philosophy, not theory, armor. The front was moving east through France, and the supply lines were stretching behind it like wire pulled too tight. Infantry divisions were burning through men and ammunition. Every tank battalion that could fight mattered. So the 761st was finally called forward. Patton told them he did not care what color they were. He cared whether they could fight. For men who had spent 2 years hearing that color was the only thing the Army cared about, the line landed hard. But speeches are not combat. Combat came on November 2nd. The 761st entered the line in eastern France, attached to infantry moving through the Saar region. They were not eased into war. They were thrown into prepared German defenses, muddy ground, broken roads, and towns where every intersection could hide an anti-tank gun. A Sherman tank was strong. It was also vulnerable. A German 75 or 88 could punch through it at range. A mine could tear off a track and turn 34 tons of steel into a coffin. A road that looked firm could swallow the whole. A bridge that looked passable could collapse under the weight. And still the 761st advanced. One of their tank commanders was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. He was from Oklahoma. He knew machinery the way poor men often know machinery, completely because failure is expensive when you have nothing to spare. Rivers had the quality soldiers recognize before they can name it. When the world narrowed to smoke, noise, and bad orders, he stayed useful. Not fearless, useful. On November 16th, near Gebling, France, Rivers' tank hit a German mine. The explosion damaged the vehicle and ripped into his right leg. The wound was serious enough that the battalion surgeon ordered him evacuated. Rivers refused. Not as a gesture, not as a performance, as a calculation. His crew was still in the fight. His company was still pushing. And men in combat understand the cost of losing the person everyone looks toward when the situation breaks. So Rivers tied off the wound and climbed back into his tank. For 3 more days he fought on that leg. 3 days of armored combat, 3 days of cold metal, pain, radio traffic, and German fire. 3 days when a surgeon's order said he should have been behind the line, and every decision he made said the line was where he was needed. On November 19th, his column came under concentrated anti-tank fire. Rivers moved his tank forward. Forward meant away from safety. Forward meant between the German guns and the tanks behind him. Forward meant drawing fire on purpose. There is no complicated way to explain that decision. He put himself where the rounds would go first. The German shell that hit his tank was direct. Rivers was killed. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation went into the system, and then the system did what systems can do when they want a truth to become quiet. It slowed, it reviewed, it downgraded, it produced no clear answer. Reuben Rivers would wait 53 years for the medal his commander tried to give him in 1944. But the war did not wait. On December 16th, the German army launched its great winter offensive through the Ardennes. 3 German armies attacked through a sector the Americans had treated as quiet. The surprise was nearly total. Roads disappeared into confusion. Units were cut off. Maps became guesses. Communications broke under weather, distance, and panic. Bastogne sat at the center of the road network. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the arteries of the battle. The 101st Airborne held it. Then the Germans surrounded it. Patton now had to do something his staff believed could not be done in the time available. Turn major elements of the Third Army 90 degrees. Move north over icy roads, in winter, under blackout, with fuel, maintenance, and traffic all fighting against the plan. Then strike into the southern flank of the German advance and open the road to Bastogne. The number Patton gave his staff was 72 hours. They told him the math was impossible. Patton told them to make the math obey. And among the units ordered north was the 761st Tank Battalion. The Black Panthers moved into the Ardennes under the kind of conditions that expose every weak system. Cold does not care about courage. Cold thickens oil. Cold cracks metal. Cold turns repairs into torture because every bolt you touch takes heat from your fingers. Tanks threw tracks on ice. Engines failed to turn. Fuel disappeared faster than planned. Maintenance crews worked in the open with frozen hands because a tank that could not move was not a tank. It was a target. The roads were narrow. The forest closed around them. German artillery had registered crossroads and bends. Anti-tank screens waited where the terrain forced armor into predictable lines. German commanders expected American armor to be delayed. Not destroyed everywhere, delayed. That was the point. Delay one column for 4 hours, delay another for 6. Turn every bridge, every town, every road bend into time bought for the forces around Bastogne. But the 761st did something that ruined that arithmetic. They did not treat contact as a place to stop. They treated it as a place to break through. One of the men who embodied that was Warren Cressy. His own battalion called him one of the most dangerous soldiers in the army. Not because he was reckless in the simple way, because when a road became a trap, he moved before the trap finished closing. Near Reuben, the column hit a prepared German position. The lead tank was struck and stopped on the road. Behind it, vehicles stacked up. German artillery began walking rounds toward the blockage. That is the moment a road becomes a killing lane. Cressy's tank was back in the column. He could not go forward on the road, so he left the road. He took his Sherman into the trees. 34 tons of tanks sliding over frozen ground, branches hammering the hull, tracks biting and losing, the driver trying to keep the vehicle upright while German fire looked for them. Cressy pushed past the disabled tank, came back onto the road ahead of the blockage, and charged the high ground. One anti-tank gun fired and missed. At that range, missing once was the end of the argument. The Sherman answered. The position folded. The machine gun nest covering the road kept firing. Cressy drove over it. In minutes, the column was moving again. Not hours, minutes. That was the difference between a plan and a rescue. Across the Ardennes, those minutes compounded. A German position expected to hold an approach for half a day might hold it for less than an hour. A screen built to slow armor until reserves arrived found the armor already through when the reserves reached the map point. The 761st was not the only unit in Patton's relief effort, but on its axis it became part of a larger fact. German commanders had not planned for. The Americans were arriving too soon. On December 26th, lead elements of the relief force reached Bastogne. The siege was broken. The 101st had held long enough for the impossible turn to become real. And when German prisoners later described the armor that hit them from the south, they did not describe the race of the men in the tanks. They described firepower, movement, the refusal to stop. Which is the most brutal irony of the story. The enemy saw the combat result clearly. The American institution that had created the battalion still struggled to admit what it meant. Because Bastogne was not the end. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was collapsing. German forces were withdrawing toward their own border. The 761st kept moving east with the Third Army toward a defensive system built for exactly this purpose, the Siegfried Line. The Germans called it the West Wall. Hundreds of miles of bunkers, pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles, concrete, wire, and interlocking fields of fire. A wall not in the simple sense, but in the military sense. A system designed to make forward motion expensive. The assumption behind it was clear. Armor attacking from the west would have to come through known approaches. Those approaches would be covered. The first tank might get hit. The second would stop. Infantry would go to ground. Engineers would be needed. Artillery would answer. Time would bleed away. And time was what Germany needed. The 761st reached those defenses after months of combat. By then, their tanks were worn in ways no parade photograph could show. Tracks needed replacement. Guns had fired hard. Engines had run too long in mud, ice, and cold. Supply priorities were not always kind to a Black Battalion. Even one with a combat record no honest report could ignore. So the men did what they had been doing since training. They kept the machines alive with hands, judgment, and stubbornness. Then came the problem no doctrine had cleanly solved. How do you attack a defensive line built to kill armor that comes the expected way? The answer was not a bigger speech. It was not a grand theory. It was the kind of solution produced by men who had been forced to understand machines, terrain, and risk, without anyone giving them the comfort of perfect conditions. A tank commander studying the ground noticed a drainage channel, narrow, frozen, below the line of sight from some of the German guns. Not an obvious road, but perhaps wide enough for a Sherman if the driver did not hesitate. That is a phrase commanders love to write after the fact. If the driver does not hesitate. Inside the tank, it means something different. It means you guide a steel box through darkness with almost no margin. It means the bank can trap you. It means a trapped tank in front of a pillbox becomes a burning landmark. It means the men behind you live or die partly on whether you can feel the ground through tracks and engine vibration. Before dawn, a 761st Sherman entered the channel. The German guns watched the road. The tank was not on the road. The first shots went where the Germans expected the Americans to be. But expectation is not reality. The Sherman kept crawling through the channel. 200 meters, then more. At the bend, the angle changed. A pillbox that had been built to face the road now showed its flank. The American gun fired. The line cracked. Once the first position failed, the geometry of the defense began to turn against itself. Weapons oriented toward the obvious approach were late against the real one. Reserves moved toward a breach that was already wider than the report that summoned them. Other tanks pushed through. By mid-morning, the 761st was inside the line. The Siegfried defenses had not vanished. No single battalion broke the whole west wall in one morning. But the lesson on that axis was unmistakable. The men officially doubted for lack of initiative were improvising against one of Germany's most deliberate defensive systems. They were not winning because war had become fair. They were winning because the battlefield measured different things than the bureaucracy. The battlefield measured whether a driver could hold a channel in darkness, whether a mechanic could bring a frozen tank back before the column moved, whether a commander could read the ground before the enemy understood the movement, whether a wounded sergeant could keep leading until the last decision cost him everything. By the spring of 1945, the 761st had fought through France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and Austria. They had spent 183 days in combat. They had supported the capture of towns, destroyed enemy positions, and paid for the record in dead and wounded men. 36 of their men were killed in action. More than 200 were casualties. Their combat record was documented. Documentation was not the same as justice. The Presidential Unit citation for the 761st did not arrive when the war ended. It did not arrive the next year. It did not arrive while the men were still young enough to feel that the country had seen them. It arrived in 1978, 33 years late. Reuben Rivers' Medal of Honor took longer. In 1993, Congress ordered a review of whether black soldiers from World War II had been denied the Medal of Honor because of racial discrimination. The review found what the men who served had already understood in their bones. The evidence had existed. The recommendations had existed. The valor had existed. What had failed was not memory. It was recognition. In 1997, President Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to the families of 7 black World War II soldiers. Reuben Rivers was one of them. His sister accepted it. Her brother had been dead for more than half a century. The file had not needed 53 years to become true. Only the institution had needed that long to say it. Paul Bates, the white officer who had commanded the 761st, had spent decades insisting his men were among the finest soldiers he had ever seen. He lived long enough to see the battalion receive its Presidential Unit Citation. He did not live long enough to see Rivers receive the Medal of Honor. That is how late the answer came. And for the men who survived, coming home did not mean entering the country they had been told they were defending. It meant returning to the one that had sent them away. The GI Bill existed. Local gatekeepers existed too. A veteran could have driven a Sherman through German fire and still find his application questioned, delayed, or denied. A man could come home from a tank battalion and be treated as if his proof had expired at the dock. Many of the 761st did what veterans often do when a nation has no room for the truth of them. They worked. They raised families. They spoke little. Not because the story was small, because the gap between what they had done and what the country was willing to hear was too large to cross every day. That is why the muddy road near Nancy matters. Not because Patton was a simple hero. He was not. Not because one forced salute fixed a segregated army. It did not. It matters because it showed the speed at which an institution can enforce a principle when someone with authority decides the rule will be real in front of witnesses. That moment took less than 5 minutes. The correction of the battalion's record took decades. The salute was immediate. The citation was late. The medal was later. And some recognition still remains unfinished. But the combat record does not wait for permission to exist. The tanks moved. The roads opened. The line cracked. Bastogne held. Rivers stayed with his crew. Cressy drove through the trees. Black mechanics kept frozen Shermans alive in weather that punished every mistake. Black officers wore rank that some men refused to see, then led men in a war that could not afford blindness. The 761st did not prove that the army was fair. They proved something more uncomfortable. They proved the army had been wrong. Wrong in its reports, wrong in its delays, wrong in its assumptions, wrong in every quiet system that mistook prejudice for judgment. German anti-tank crews did not care what an American personnel board had written in 1925. Concrete pillboxes did not care what a reviewer believed about race. Frozen roads did not care who was supposed to be capable. War stripped the argument down to function. Can you move? Can you fight? Can you repair? Can you lead? Can you keep going when every designed obstacle says stop? The 761st answered in steel, snow, and blood. The salute took 5 minutes. The recognition took half a century. The record was written on time.